Hello, everyone. Welcome to Queen Mary, and to this, the 99th meeting of the Whitehall Group. It also happens to be the second occasion in which we are able to remember a former colleague of ours, John Ramsden, and I think Peter might say something about John shortly. My name is Jeremy Jennings, and until midnight tonight, I am the head of the School of Politics and International Relations. And I confess I couldn't think of a more enjoyable way of ending my time with Queen Mary than by introducing our guest this evening, Mr. Charles Moore. So I'm sure many of you know, Charles Moore was educated in Cambridge, and then subsequently went into journalism, where he became editor of the Daily Telegraph, the Spectator, and the Sunday Telegraph. He still writes columns for the Spectator and for the Daily Telegraph, and there has a devoted and enthusiastic readership, amongst whom I include myself. I'm one of those people for whom the dreaded words "Charles Moore is away" can spoil the entire weekend, as my wife knows to her cost. That Friday evening glass of white wine is not quite the same when I'm not reading his column in The Spectator. None of us will ever forget his long battle with the BBC not to pay a television license for a television he did not own. It is legendary and was great fun while it was going on. But apart from that, I don't think we could have a better person this evening to mark our second John Ramsden event. As you will know, John Ramsden was an extremely distinguished historian of the Conservative Party, and tonight we are very fortunate to have as our guest the author of the official biography of Mrs. Thatcher, the first volume of that official biography. And I'm sure that many of you have already read it, and those of you who have read it will know that it is a truly marvelous book, full of the most marvelous insights about a remarkable woman, but one learns new things about her virtually on every page. It is quite a marvelous read. So we're very, very fortunate this evening to have Charles Moore with us. This evening, what we're going to do is focus. We'll have a discussion between Pete Hennessy and Charles Moore, and where the focus will be on Mrs. Thatcher's relationship with the civil service. And I presume that'll go on for about half an hour. Then we'll have half an hour of questions. And I think there were two things, really. One is Charles Moore, when I saw him a few weeks ago, one thing he said was that essentially the discussion will only be on the period covered by Volume 1, which is up to 1982, to the end of the Falklands War, so subsequent events we shall leave to one side. And secondly, in terms of questions, well, I'm sure feel free to ask whatever questions you wish, as long as it's within that time frame. Don't, I suppose, feel constrained necessarily by the issue of the civil service. I'm sure Peter will ask some extremely probing questions and so on, but before I hand over to him, if I, on that theme of Mrs. Thatcher and the civil service, if I might just refer to one part of the book, which is on page 406. And this refers to the moment of the transition period in 1979 between being the opposition party and moving and becoming the government, and that transition where civil servants were having their first exploratory discussions with what turned out to be the incoming Conservative team. And on page 406, Charles Moore cites notes taken by Bernard Donahue. Some of you might remember him. Bernard Donahue, And the conversations Bernard Donahue had with Kenneth Stowe, who was Jim Callaghan's principal private secretary. And this is the quotation which we have there. Quote, "Ken says she, Mrs. Thatcher, gives the impression of wanting to run the whole show herself. It is clear that the civil service is viewing the prospect of her arriving with some dismay." With that, I'll hand you over to my colleague and dear friend, Peter Hennessy.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much. Can I add my welcome to you all to this special John Ramsden occasion? John was a beloved colleague of mine. He was one of the greatest ever servants of this college in so many ways, and I'm delighted Sue Ramsden's with us this evening. And John, most weeks I think of John probably 4 times, and quite a lot recently, because his comments on the Ashes the other day would have been eagerly sought by me. The emotional geography of coalition government would have been something he would have been remarkably fascinating on too. And almost every day I think, what would John have made of this? And he taught several people here. He was a great teacher, and we miss him greatly. So this evening is in his honour. And I can think of nobody better than Charles Moore on the subject of Whitehall. Now, Whitehall, you might think, is not the most throbbing of subjects of Mrs. Thatcher's primary coloured premiership. The Mile End group are sort of nerds, really. But I think even by the nerdish standards of the Mile End group, because it's Mrs. Thatcher and because it's the senior civil service, it's the most wonderful mix. It's an anthropological case study. And Clive Priestley and Ian Beasley, his colleague, is here today, who got his PhD today here in the efficiency unit, Derek Rayner's efficiency unit. Clive once said that civil service reform over the decades since the war had been like successive waves washing up against a very hard rock of the civil service, and the civil service by and large had to wait for time and tide, and it would recede. But Mrs. Thatcher was different. She placed sticks of dynamite on that rock. And the period covered by Charles's book, this most wonderful book, covers those early encounters. And I'm glad to say that many of the senior officials who work most closely with her are here this evening. So we've got just exactly the mix you would want. And it's a most wonderful book, and I do commend it to you. And Charles is a cornucopic writer, but this is not only, it's his first book and his first biography. When you think of the bravery of making Mrs. T, with that huge archive and that most remarkable premiership, your first work between hard covers, it's Stakhanovite in its scope and scale, but Charles, you've pulled it off. And Charles is going to speak for about 10 minutes on that theme. Then he and I will have a very brief conversation, and we'll open it up for discussion, and we'll finish on the button at 8, as is our tradition, and we're going to have a drink. You're all very welcome, especially you, Charles, and Sue.
Can I do it on this one? Thank you, Peter, Jeremy. Ladies and gentlemen, am I wired up? Can you hear me? So I'll just put this down. First of all, one clarification. It's true that I can only speak with any accuracy about, and even, of course, that will be challenged by this august audience, about the first volume period, so that ends with victory in the Falklands. But I slightly misled Jeremy. I'm absolutely happy to try to answer questions and take part in discussion for the whole of her life, but obviously there will be 2 problems about post-82. One is that sometimes I will know things that I'm not allowed to reveal, and the bigger problem is that I won't know things because I haven't yet got there. So, but please feel absolutely free, Peter, and everybody in the questions, to talk about that. First of all, I should just say that on this, before going into the subject of Mrs. Thatcher and Whitehall, that I came to this book, as Peter said, I haven't written one before, and I came to this book as a journalist. And one of the things that I've discovered doing it is how little journalists understand about politics in a certain respect. And that really is that they don't understand about government. So we are well trained to understand the sort of game of politics, and we understand how politicians play that game, and we observe elections, and we're good at who's in, who's out, and who's stabbing whom, and we're also good at the sort of presentational and rhetorical aspects, and sometimes quite good at the ideological aspects, and at political analysis, and at what Evelyn Waugh, talking to Randolph Churchill, called the the sound of political gossip on whiskey-laden breath is our thing. But we don't know how government is conducted, and we're not terribly interested in it, and we don't report it much, and so we understand very little about civil servants. And the great revelation for me, not so much about Margaret Thatcher, but just in general doing this book, is how civil servants think and how they contribute to the understanding of my subject. And without wishing to be rude about either my colleagues or politicians, I have found that in terms of the reliability of witness, civil servants greatly exceed politicians or journalists. And the reason for this, I think, is that they're trained to remember and to record. That's how they, and also to some extent at least, they don't have a dog in the fight. So they watch what all these people are doing, whereas the people who are doing it do it. And if you're doing it, you don't have time to think about what did actually happen. And this is particularly true of Mrs. Thatcher herself, who's the most useless witness to her own life in the sense of what happened when. And I don't mean, of course, with her sadly declining mental powers in the 21st century. I mean that in general, she moved forward, tended to remember in a meeting what she had said and not what anybody else had said, and even didn't actually remember really what she had said either, but a sort of impression about what it was that she was trying to convey. Whereas a private secretary, and I think the private secretaries in particular, are the most important witnesses in this sense, because that really is their job, to observe what the Prime Minister is doing and saying all the time and to advise on it. And so they're unbelievably important in this book. And this is true in oral. I've interviewed 315 people for the first volume, and I haven't actually counted how many of them are civil servants, but it's absolutely key to it. And it's also true, of course, in the documentation, because in all the government documentation, it's virtually all mediated by civil servants. And of course, the civil servants are translating Mrs. Thatcher's way of thinking and speaking and writing, because she would write onto each document little furious remarks, and they would then have to turn them into something, a memo going down the line, which conveyed some, but not perhaps all, of the fury as it percolated through the system. When Mrs. Thatcher began in politics, she only held, as you know, 2 ministerial jobs before she was Prime Minister. The first as Parliamentary Under-Secretary at the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance, and the second as Secretary of State for Education. And in the first, she arrived at in the Macmillan government and arrived at the office, and Sir Eric Bowyer, the permanent secretary, said, she's trouble, we're going to have to give her something to do to keep her busy. And he immediately observed this point that she was so keen to do something, and he saw that was a dangerous thing. However, I have no record of there being antagonistic relationships of a serious kind between her and officials in that post. It wasn't a very political post. She was very good at executing it. Michael Partridge, who was involved, is, I hope, still alive, certainly was alive. He is still alive, yes, good. When I interviewed him, and this was clearly a very good way of her cutting her teeth. As Secretary of State for Education, it was much more fraught, and she felt 2 things, really. One, that the civil servants simply let her down. I mean, they didn't tell her, for example, about the famous milk business, that her attempt to cut school milk would require legislation. So she was caught out on that one. And she also felt that they were ideologically opposed to her, which, in my opinion, talking to them was true, by and large, and therefore that it was very difficult to handle. However, she did eventually establish good relationships with many of them, and many of them speak with a sort of odd mixture of feelings about her, of which admiration is certainly one, but certainly not the only one. And and she felt that this had been a real struggle, and that she had her mental model of it was that she'd had to overcome the officials to do anything. When she became Prime Minister, therefore, she was well, by modern standards, experienced, but by traditional standards, inexperienced in Whitehall, and clearly apprehensive about it. And I think, like most politicians who are trying to change things, would have had a rhetoric of sort of being against the civil service in some vague, general way. In fact, did have such a rhetoric. And when she came in, however, pretty much as she physically entered Downing Street for the first time as Prime Minister, already there were all the people in the hall who were the civil servants, and the tiny number of, by modern standards, tiny number of people she was bringing in who were not career civil servants. And as Michael Dobbs, who was one of those brought in, though he's very quickly kicked out again, actually, due to a confusion, said it seemed an uneven contest. And she turned very quickly after the first introductions to Ken Stowe, who she'd inherited as Principal Private Secretary, and said, "Ken, what do I do now?" And he said something like, "Well, you have to form an administration," or some words to that effect. There was that interesting moment of inexperience when, and for the civil servants, some pleasure, because they thought, oh, she's not going to try to have a battle about everything. We may be able to get somewhere together. Yes, Ken, what do I do now? That was the phrase. And I think it would again be fair to say that they were somewhat against her politically. I don't mean that they were Labour Party people or anything like that, but they were very much from that consensus era, and the word she hated was consensus, and what she wanted to change was this idea of automatic consensus for decline, and there was a big anxiety about that. However, my feeling is that Margaret Thatcher was, though she wanted to bring about change, was not very interested in the machinery of government, and was not what you might call a rational actor in the world of how to set out Whitehall models, how to recalibrate them. One of the great myths about Mrs. Thatcher is that she's rational, and I mean this as a compliment to her, by the way, that she wasn't so very rational, because and John Hoskins, the head of the policy unit, was always criticizing her because she didn't have a strategy, and what in business they call the critical path, and which he called the critical path. You haven't got this overall idea of how you're going to do something, or even what it is you're trying to do. And it was very good that she didn't have that, it seems to me, because she's basically a politician. So what she had was a big idea about what she wanted to do, but no real idea about how to do it except by the force of will. So what she's saying all the time, and what she used to say is, I know what, you tell me how. That's what she used to say to her advisors all the time. And this was basically true. And that actually, if you are an enthusiastic civil servant, is a good position to find yourself in with a prime minister. Because that's what you are supposed to do. You're supposed to tell them how, and they're supposed to know what. And usually they don't, and so you can't. And this was not true in this case. So once the sort of act of translation had taken place, so that civil servants could listen to what Mrs. Thatcher was on about, they could then start to do her will, but in a way that made her will more rational and more orderly than she herself would have made it alone. And I think it was a good thing, in other words, that she was not at all bureaucratically minded herself. I've often thought with John Major that one of his problems as Prime Minister was he's a brilliant bureaucrat, and if he had been to university, he would have been a bureaucrat. But he was, of course, not permitted to even think about entering the top echelons of the civil service because he had only 2 O-levels or something like that.
3, I think.
3. So he was excluded, but I think his mentality was rather that of a very able bureaucrat. And by the way, he's very good at remembering meetings. Again, very, as I say, not a politician's gift. She was not like that. And that, in a curious way, I think made it quite easy, well, easy is absolutely the wrong word, actually, but it gave a proper role for the civil servants. And though she wanted to change everything, she had no interest in sort of elaborate structures and sort of boring meetings about how you set those things up. So what she's really doing is saying, go off and do all these things. I mean, another example would be with the policy unit, which she set up, and she got it wrong to start with, and it gradually emerged. I was amazed to discover with the policy unit that she never, literally never, asked them to do anything. She never said, because she didn't know how to do that. And if you talk about with the appointment of civil servants, this was also true, that it's famous when she interviewed civil servants for private secretary jobs and so forth. She didn't know what to ask them, and she didn't really ask them anything. And she wasn't capable of working out, in that sense, what it was they were supposed to be doing. And so what you had to do, if you wished to serve her, was to work this out yourself from her general declaratory utterances and from her behaviour. And then you had to satisfy her by being able to produce the goods on time and with great clarity and verve and dedication. And I think what gradually she came to realise was that civil servants were a huge benefit for her. There's a moment when she looks up one day and says to Clive Whitmore, who was her principal private secretary after Ken Stowe, and she says something like, Clive, do you know this government would be much better conducted if I didn't have any cabinet, I just had permanent secretaries. You can see why she thinks that, because basically they work for her and the cabinet colleagues don't. And so there's an instinctive, you could say, lack of respect for cabinet government in her mind, or if you were to put it more kindly, you'd say that she was very aware of how a cabinet is a coalition of a whole load of people who you don't necessarily want to be there particularly, but whom you must have there. That's particularly true in the early days, whereas the civil service are actually there to get government done, and she's the head of government, and so she can get them on her side. And so while she had a great hatred of bureaucracy, she had a great respect for bureaucrats, if they were of the top quality. And gradually, of course, those relationships often strengthened and really became important. So in diplomatic affairs, Tony Parsons, Nico Henderson, later, of course, Charles Pole, Robin Rennick, and then in domestic ones, Clive Whitmore, Michael Scholar, who was Economic Treasury Private Secretary, Peter Middleton at the Treasury, Robin Butler, Andrew Turnbull, and so on, and indeed, because don't forget that he, unlike in modern times, where it's all changed, Bernard Ingham, because he was a civil servant, and he was not a political appointment. And people forget that because they think of him so much as his mistress's voice, but he was actually a career civil servant and had worked for Tony Benn, among others. And so I think that what happened gradually was that she sort of came to enjoy it, and one thing was that she did enjoy being Prime Minister very much the whole time. And that's quite infectious, because often they don't after a bit. And I think there was a lot of mutual testing, and there's a famous dinner recorded in the book when the permanent secretaries were all got in 1980, and unfortunately it happened just after the Prince's Gate siege, when the SAS burst into the Iranian embassy, which was occupied, and sorted out all the terrorists. And the dinner was the next day, and there was a very painful contrast in Mrs. Thatcher's mind between the boys in black and the men in grey who were coming to this dinner of permanent secretaries. And she thought in her mind, here are all these people who can do things, and here are all these people who are telling me I can't do things. And Ian Bancroft, who was the head of the civil service and presided over this dinner, it was a most unhappy occasion. And Ian Bancroft eventually fell from grace and from his job, and the whole system of running the civil service in that separate way was abolished. And Frank Cooper, who was Permanent Secretary at Defence, he left the room at one point in this painful dinner, and everyone said, "Where's Frank gone?" "Oh, he's gone to get the SAS." So this was the sort of running joke of it. And what she said to Robert Armstrong, Cabinet Secretary, was, "Robert, they're all against me, I can feel it." That's what she said that night. And possibly that was true at that moment, because one mustn't forget one's always trying in history to work out what was it like at that time. And at that time, it looked as if she might fail and that she wasn't getting anywhere. And so they probably were all against her. I don't mean they were all necessarily ideologically against her or being naughty or plotting against her. I think they just didn't believe that she was going to do what she said she was going to do. And she sensed that very much. But then, of course, everything changed. And it changed because of the 1981 budget, because of the Falklands War. And from then on, her star had risen, and she was dominant. And people began to see what it was that she was on about and how it was interesting to try to do it. I must stop, but I just think, come back to this thing, civil servants, that word, civil servants. She came to recognize that they were servants, and actually she was very good with servants, Mrs. Thatcher, at all levels, because once she believed that people were working for her, she trusted them, and she treated them well. Whereas if they were working with her rather than for her, that's to say cabinet colleagues, she treated them frequently extremely badly. And therefore, from the typist and the person on the door, up through the garden room, the private secretaries, to the cabinet secretary himself, she was inclined to be courteous. The more courteous you got, lower down the scale of importance in the job, but nevertheless courteous and interested and sort of on their side. And she loved the idea of these people working for her. And if she hated, of course, having nothing to do. One day she went into a private secretary's office, and the private secretary, I can't remember which one it was. Perhaps I'm not allowed to say. I forget whether it. Anyway, I think it might have been Michael Scott. Anyway, he was on the phone, and he didn't realise she was in the room, and he was just having a row with the Treasury, which he felt he just lost. And he banged the phone down, and he said, S word, F word, bang. And suddenly realised the Prime Minister was just, who of course never used such words, was just behind him. And he was horrified, but her eyes were sort of gleaming with delight, and she just said, temper, temper. And she loved seeing all these people fighting for her as she saw it. And so a sort of beautiful friendship began. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Charles, very much. Drawing on that last theme, it became apparent quite early on for people watching from the outside, as I was from the Times in those days, that Mrs. Thatcher's admiration and affection for almost the extended family in Number 10, the Cabinet Office in some cases, was very palpable, but it was in stark contrast to her views of the civil service as a breed.
Yes.
And
yeah.
I remember Ian Bancroft saying to me once that, pointing this out to me, but also saying that she thinks there are too many of us and that there are too many clever people in Whitehall and that we should be out making profits. That's what the country really needed. And I'm not sure she ever lost that, but she remained close and intensely loyal to everybody who'd served her, several of whom are here,
yes.
to a remarkable degree. And there was always this
yes.
juxtaposition, wasn't there?
That's true. And in some ways, I think that analysis by Ian Bancroft is correct. However, I don't think she did make the vulgar error of thinking that the civil servants should be making profits. That's a sort of post-Thatcher vulgar heresy, I think, a sort of Thatcherite heresy. She did, in fact, think that civil servants should be civil servants, not pseudo-businessmen. And I don't think she really welcomed the sort of jargon in which everything is a business case and, you know, all this rubbish now. Though she may have been responsible for some of this rubbish coming in, actually, because she may have not quite seen how it was going to go. What's perfectly true is that she saw the bureaucracy collectively as a brake on British entrepreneurialism and economic success. I think that's not so much because of a contempt for... It wasn't that she wished the civil servants to be businessmen, but it was that they all were part of a great system with the vested interest in decline, if you like. And they were sort of... The productive bit of Britain was getting nowhere, and the unproductive bit of Britain was too big and was too powerful.
I always thought she was wrong about the civil service as the incarnation of defeatist declinism, because the ones I knew felt that decline palpably and didn't care for it one little bit, and I think she got that wrong. And she'd heard that William Armstrong, who'd left the civil service after being unwell in just after the great crisis, Ted Heathwinter crisis, that he'd said to somebody in number 10, our job is the orderly management of decline, which I think he did say. But she extrapolated from that the whole breed was organised to the gentle decline of the United Kingdom. And I do think she was wrong.
Yes, and I think there was always a difference between what she said about these matters and how she acted. And I think she also knew about how if you say something quite rough, it sort of puts people on their mettle, and which she intended to do. So she wanted people to be made to pass tests. So she wouldn't actually, I think, really believe that all bureaucrats were invested in the decline of Britain. But she thought if she said it, that would stir it up and would see what happened. I mean, the most obvious example of this is with the Foreign Office, where she'd always say how awful the Foreign Office was. But some of her best relationships were with Foreign Office people.
Like Tony Parsons.
Yeah.
Tony Parsons was very funny about that. I think he said it publicly somewhere. I think he might have said it to you, actually. It was when he was briefly her Foreign Affairs advisor in number 10 for a year after the Falklands. And she said to him one day, Tony, I'm so glad I'm not a member of your class.
Yes, yes.
And Tony Parsons said, what class would that be, Prime Minister? Upper middle class, said Mrs. T. Why do you say that, Prime Minister? Because people from the upper middle class like you, Tony, are so good at understanding other people's points of view. Now, I suspect there was more than an element of wind-up in that, and Tony Parsons was a tremendous chap.
Yes.
And he thought it was hilarious. I mean, he used to tell the story with great
relish.
Yes.
Well, of course, she liked him, and that's partly that he actually, another slightly surprising thing about Mrs. Thatcher is that she liked people who had class confidence. So she actually liked posh people, in fact, as long as they didn't patronise her. Because he felt confident enough to sort of laugh in her presence and things like that. And because she was very intimidating to a lot of people, that often meant that the conversations didn't go very well, but with somebody like him, they did, because he knew he could.
And he was dashing. She liked dashing blokes.
Yes, no, there's definitely a physiognomical history of male relationships with Margaret Thatcher to be done. Yes, well, I have done part of it.
You didn't mention the great Derek Rayner, and Ian Beasley worked very closely with Derek, and he was still working at Marks and Spencer, but did it part-time for her. And she said, "She's a remarkable and wonderful person." She was saying this in public. Yeah. But I used to get the impression, maybe wrongly, that she didn't ever really fully understand or want to get into the intricacies of managerial reform, but she trusted him to do it.
Yeah.
And the most important decision she made was choosing him rather than Leslie Chapman, who used to be in the Property Services Agency and written a book called Your Disobedient Servant, who wanted actually civil servants to be prosecuted if they failed to deliver.
Yes.
And she very early on decided Leslie Chapman was not, although she'd spoken to him in opposition a lot, I think, was not the one to do it, and that Derek Rayner would travel light with Ian and Clive and a small team, and would find reform-minded individuals within the system to do it. And she backed them to the hilt. I mean, Ian, I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. But he was a crucial figure in those early years.
I think that's completely right. And I think it went on. I mean, I only mention it at its inception in Volume 1, and I will say more about the whole process as it developed in Volume 2. I think your essential analysis of this is correct, though I'm a bit hesitant with the N in the room, and as I haven't yet done the full work on it. But I think this goes to something about Mrs. Thatcher, which she wasn't at all, as I say, not very interested in machinery, and also not at all radical about the whole British Constitution. What she was radical was about the sort of exercise of the will to make this great thing work and do something. That's what she was trying to do, and she wasn't trying to create massive new institutions and rename everything and abolish everything. And similarly with privatization, you know, she was very, very keen to do it, but she, quite interestingly, I think, didn't sort of get involved in every bit of how you do it, and rightly so. You know, you can't have... her general fault was to do too much. And, you know, luckily on this area, she realized that not to try and do that.
One last thought before we open it up. Roy Jenkins, in a book called 9 Men of Power, had an essay on Ernest Bevin. And he invented a rather good game in that essay. And he said Ernest Bevin could have held only 2 jobs in the post-war Foreign Office. One was Secretary of State, and the other was a rather irascible lift man on the verge of retirement. Now, where would Mrs. T have been if she'd been in the civil service hierarchy?
Well, of course, funnily enough, maybe she could have been, because her cast of mind in youth was a bit more like that of a civil servant, because her sort of ego hadn't completely developed. So her first ambition as a child was to be in the Indian civil service. That was what she wanted to do when she was about 10. Because I think one of the keys to her way of thinking is that she's a sort of imperialist, really. She thinks that the British way of doing everything is by far the best in the world, and therefore the logic would be that Britain would rule the world. That's what's in the back of her. And why shouldn't it be she doing it in India? That would be her.
So she could have been viceroy.
Well, she would. I suppose
India.
it would have been against her at the time, wouldn't it? But she would have. That was her first. So, and also the logical aspect of her mind, like putting things out in sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments. That's what she used to do. In her early speeches were boring in that way because they were sort of consecutive. And so possibly she would have been a good civil servant, but she would have been, and of course, very conscientious and mastered the subject. But she would have been very frustrated by it, I think.
Yes.
And more likely to see, suppose she'd been without an Oxford degree, I can much more see her as the sort of furious and incredibly energetic tea lady or something like that than a sort of middle-ranking civil servant.
Yes.
And indeed, she was quite a
What
tea
a
lady
thought.
when she was Prime Minister because, she was always cooking for all these people. And
Ferdinand called it her little red hen mode.
yes, exactly. Yeah.
I wonder before opening out, if Robert Armstrong would like to comment, because we have her Cabinet Secretary here, and then Andrew Turnbull, who is their Principal Private Secretary, perhaps, and then we can go wider.
Well, I think Charles has put his finger on almost all the points. She wasn't interested in organisation. She wasn't interested in reconstructing departments or redistributing functions. She was interested in the policy and the people who did it, the people who were going to put it into effect. And whether they were in the department of this or the department of that was a very secondary and something she didn't really think about or know about. I think she was suspicious of the civil service, maybe partly because of what she thought William Armstrong had said. I think he had said about the organisation of decline. But I think she thought that it was a necessary thing. You couldn't do without it, but that it had to be prodded along. It had to be pushed along. And she, as Charles has said, she greatly distrusted the Foreign Office because she thought that they were engaged in pursuing the interests of other countries ahead of the interests of Britain. And she was deeply suspicious, I'm afraid, of the Department of Education because of her experience there as Secretary of State. Those two departments in particular were difficult. But of course, as Charles has said, she did very much like particular people in the civil service. And one could reel off a list of these people who she found congenial and good to work for. And they were doers rather than mere talkers or thinkers. As regards to that terrible dinner, which is etched on my mind irrevocably, and I shall never forget it, I think there was a divide between the younger permanent secretaries who would basically have been more sympathetic, but were reluctant to speak, were a bit intimidated by the occasion. And so the discussion was dominated by the old hands who thought they'd seen this all before and perhaps had a little bit too much wine and became quite almost aggressive, some of them really. It was a terrible, terrible occasion.
Thank you, Robert, very much. Would Andrew Turnbull like to add? Yes, sorry.
I think I just wanted to add that she found the whole business of, she thought the thing ought to be well managed, but she didn't enter into the business of how you got it well managed at all, really. And there was the Civil Service Department doing its best to establish better management in the civil service. And she wrote it off because it didn't have responsibility for any policy. It the papers it produced, the minutes and the memoranda it produced, were full of management speak, which she greatly distrusted. I've been looking recently at the Francis Maud's papers, Civil Service Reform, 1 year on, and I tremble to think what would have happened if we had shown that to Margaret Thatcher. She described the stuff she got from the Civil Service Department as guffy stuff, and it got nowhere with her at all. And this was partly the problem when, of course, the time came when she decided to wind it up.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Would Andrew Turnbull like to comment as well? Principal Private Secretary.
Can I start by saying, Charles, how much I enjoyed, I'm only about page 500. I wish I had been able to read the chapter on her life in opposition, and in particular all the unofficial voices. Because I would have understood, when I was there in 83, I understood what she was on about and why these people were important to her so much better. I think you've got this relationship absolutely right. There's a hierarchy of things she didn't like through to the things that she did. She didn't like the state, government, departments, permanent secretaries ex officio, public sector unions, including the civil service union, she greatly disliked. And then you get down to the people that she really did like. And I can illustrate this point about how she preferred the company of civil servants. My wife and I went to lunch one Sunday, and about 3:45, people started drifting away. And she said, "Oh, do stay behind, do stay behind. Wait till they've all gone." And then she got down to a discussion of how we could get the central bank governor of Switzerland to come and talk to us, or Greenspan, in order to talk about narrow money. But so she just wanted to talk shop with the people she really trusted, and the sooner you get those people out the door, the better.
Yeah. Richard, next to you, Richard Wilson, I think you were in the Cabinet Secretariat at this time.
Not at the time of the...
No, a bit later, wasn't it?
Later on, yes.
But her style was remarkable with civil service. I think she said to you after a ministerial cabinet meeting, "Why won't they do what I asked them to do?"
Yes.
I mean, so she would confide in civil servants about the shortcomings of her ministerial colleagues.
But as if the government was not something she was part of.
Quite, yeah.
But I also remember Robert saying, after I'd been in the job for about 3 months, and we were going through the door, which at that time used a key, and Robert said...
it's the door between number 10 and the
between
Cabinet
number
Office.
10 and the Cabinet Office, saying, "Well done." I said, "Why?" And he said, "You've passed the test. She thinks you're all right." And it was a very important moment, because... Can I ask a question?
Yes, of
Charles?
course.
Because when she had sort of retired, if that's the right word, we were taken, a number of us were invited to go and talk to her and sort of take our leave of her. And she was talked at length about the unfairness of what had happened and how wrong it was. And it's very hard to know what to say. And I rather foolishly said to her, "Well, maybe now you're going to have to leave it to history." And she looked at me with horror, and she said, "Oh, no, you should always give history a little help." So did she talk to you about the book? Did you have conversations with her? Did she try to give history?
Well, this was a
little
fascinating
help?
thing. Yes, no, a fascinating thing, and to me a surprising thing. It all worked, and thank you, Richard, because you were very wonderful, because you let me have the official historian status, though I'm not an official historian, and that allowed me to see the government paper. This all happened in 97, 98, and it was her idea that I should do this book. She'd been advised that somebody was going to write her biography. Why didn't she pick someone? The papers were already deposited at Churchill in 97, I think, and why didn't she pick someone to give them a sort of head start and say, have access to the paper, have access to Margaret Thatcher's papers, to me, my family, etc. And she very kindly chose me for reasons which I've never really known. I didn't apply or anything, it wasn't advertised and so on. I don't really know what happened. And she was as good as her word about all this, and I had lots of conversations with her before her memory became too poor to have formal interviews. and with Dennis and all sorts of, and of course with her sister Muriel, all sorts. And she stipulated from the first that she should not be allowed to read the book and it should not appear in her lifetime. And this was marvellous for me, and her stated reason for it was, and I think at least one of her true reasons, was that she didn't want people to think she was trying to control the book. And so that was a tremendous advantage for me. But I must say, I thought she would try to control it nevertheless. And I was worried about that. And she literally never, I mean, not once did she say, don't say this, do say that. She didn't even say, what are you going to say? She was absolutely uninterested in what I was going to say. And had just didn't think about it, I think. And I thought it was marvellous. But I thought it was, somehow her attitude was, I think, I've done it. And she didn't like raking over the coals, and she had a big idea of her own myth and importance, but she didn't want to rake over the coals of everything like a male politician would, and so it wasn't, sort of Harold Macmillan, Roy Jenkins type posters, wasn't I clever when I said that witty thing and got round, defeated the Foreign Secretary on such an issue or whatever. She just doesn't think like that. And it was incredible liberation for me, I must say.
Ian, would you like a quick word? Machine coming down.
Thank you. I feel quite overawed, really, following such larger figures than mine. I was a very, very small cog in the wheel working for Derek Rayner in what became known as the efficiency unit, and saw her. And one of the things that struck me is interesting is for somebody who is not interested in structure, she did actually abolish a department. But she abolished the department, I think, because she looked at whether people cared enough to do things. I can remember having a conversation with her, and I think it was about nurses, but I can't quite be sure. And there was a lot of stuff in the press about angels on the ward and so on. And in the course of this, she suddenly turned and said, it's not enough just to talk about it. If you really care about it, you have to do something about it. And I think that probably the most important advantage that happened on the efficiency side was that when Rayner was appointed, John Hunt, who was Cabinet Secretary, arranged for Rayner to go to the 10 o'clock Wednesday morning meetings on at least 3 occasions to get the permanent secretaries, at least some of them on side, and maybe a majority of them sitting on the fence, but only a small minority who would try and block things. And that was an extremely smart move by Hunt and by Bancroft, who was backing him up behind that.
Thank you. Right, who'd like to start us off? Yes, please, gentlemen here.
One anecdote about...
Bruce, yes, sorry.
Sorry, one anecdote about Teddy Parsons and one about Emile. Teddy, it is said that early on when he was her foreign affairs advisor, Mrs. T got into a debate about Europe and said, that's it, we shall leave the European community next Tuesday. And Teddy, completely untroubled, said, be that as it may, Prime Minister, we've still got to work out what to do between now and Tuesday. And it said there was another meal. I don't know whether Robert or others could confirm it early on. There was a crisis, and there were lots of permanent secretaries and deputy secretaries, some to number 10, and they were ready for a long evening. But the Prime Minister suddenly said, have all of you let your wives know that you will be late home for supper? A thought which had not crossed any of their minds. And she said, right, you make those phone calls, I'll organise some sandwiches. And at that stage, I think they'd have walked through fire for her.
Thank you, Bruce, yes. Right at the back. Yes, or nearly at the back, yes. Gentleman with this, who's looking round. Yes. Purple shirt. Another clue needed.
Thank you very much, and I enormously enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed a very different talk you gave on the different aspects of Thatcher, so these talks are going institution. On the civil service, to what degree do you think she was actually blocked from achieving stuff in the Department of Education, achieving her agenda? And to what degree do you think she was blocked in the early years of her government? And do you see a change? Because you're very interesting both in the book and now on the relationships, but to what degree do you think that it actually affected her, this opposition, in terms of what policy change she achieved?
Well, in education, I think really it wasn't at all easy for her to do anything anyway, almost regardless of the attitude of the bureaucrats, because in those, first of all, she's very junior in the government, and secondly, the Department of Education had very few powers in those days. It was essentially paying out the money for teachers, and that's about it, really. However, it is also true that she was entirely unsympathetic to the way it was all going in education, and the department was sort of mentally invested in the way it was all going in education, so there was a natural conflict. And in the end, she could only get on in the world, actually, by becoming a big spending minister. And she got a good reputation within the system for that thing which, you know, as an outsider, I don't admire so much, which is just being able to get tons more money for your department, regardless of whether it's well spent, which is one of the great features of. And in the end, that white paper, Education, a Framework for Expansion, was just, you could almost call it Education, let's spend more money. I mean, that was, that's what happened. So she felt that she hadn't really got anywhere in terms of what she believed. I don't think that... well, of course, the big struggle that's going on in the period covered by this book in officialdom, there's a certain amount about the civil service itself and the civil service strike and structures and so on, but the really big thing, of course, is the economic policy and, you know, whether you're going to be able to pull it off or not. I mean, whether you're going to be able to do what she said she was going to do, bring down inflation, reduce government spending, etc., etc. And I do think it's very important. Obviously, a civil servant with a career to think of has to work out all the time. Politicians are always saying, let's do this, let's do that. And presumably what a civil servant is always doing is testing. Well, do they really want to do it? Have they even got the faintest chance of doing it? You know, is it just nonsense that I have to listen to? Because, and of course, and also, are the colleagues up for it? Are the political colleagues up for it? And none of these answers were immediately obvious with Mrs. Thatcher's administration. And remember that in 1981, President Reagan was inaugurated in January of that year, and when she was the first European leader to visit him, his Treasury Secretary appeared on the Capitol Hill that day while she was there and said that all her policies were useless and were failing. And Reagan himself gave a tremendous boost for her by sort of endorsing her and making much of her. But the whole judgment of the world, the jury was out, even among sympathetic people, among whether she was going to get anywhere. And she might very well have lost her job that year, and there were sort of plots against her. So everybody had to work this out, and markets were wondering too. And the great change that happened with the 1981 budget was that the markets at last believed the government. But until that point, you know, a civil servant may well think, well, why should I exert myself to do anything? And then, of course, there would have been Treasury officials who didn't agree with the policy anyway, of the older generation, people like Douglas Wass. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily be in exactly an open revolt, but they'd be highly sceptical. So it was a long process, actually. It was 2.5 years, really, before, or more than 2 years anyway, before people thought, right, well, this is what she wants, and this is what she is doing, and we will do it.
Mm. Yes, gentleman next to the microphone, yes.
Alistair MacDonald, former civil servant, but happily in neither the Foreign Office nor the Department of Education. The phrase that most people associate, if you put together Margaret Thatcher and the civil service, is a simple one: is he one of us? And that's often mentioned in the press even today as an example of early politicization of the civil service. Now, one detects from your book, and particularly the story about the teenager who was suffering from depression, that Mrs. Thatcher couldn't understand why that young man, was not full of action and wanted to achieve things in his life. That actually she meant by the phrase, is he one of us? Is he a doer rather than a talker? But how do you think it's come about that it's become a phrase associated with making the civil service political?
Yes, I mean, I think she did very little to make the civil service political, and I don't think she saw, in an odd way, she wasn't very ideological. I think you're right to think that the is he one of us was sort of, is he on board for all for the adventure? Not what does he believe? Didn't interest her what he believed.
When I was making recommendations for the appointment of further secretary, she never asked me, is he one of us? Never.
Yeah. Yes. Well,
would you have told her? Would you have told her if she had asked, Robert? No, I didn't think you would. I didn't think you would.
She knew that.
Yeah.
You know this famous story about her and the Monty Python dead parrot, because there was the Liberal Democrats have this bird, or had it as their symbol, and the speechwriter said for the party conference they wanted to make a joke about the dead parrot in her speech, and she had never heard of Monty Python or the dead parrot or anything, and she said, "Is it funny?" And they said, "Yes, Prime Minister, it is very funny, yes." And being a thorough woman before, because she couldn't understand anything about it, so she said, "Could we have the video in and we'll watch the dead parrot sketch to see before we..." And so they came in and watched it. And of course, they were all so nervous, all her advisors, that they were rolling around with laughter as it was played, because they were just so tense. And she, absolutely stationary, not disapproving, but 100% uncomprehending, just no idea what this was at all. But anyway, being very professional about speeches, and she accepted the advice that this was a sensible thing and it would go down well, etc. So she rehearsed it. And it was the party conference. She was just about to go on stage, and she went with a friend of mine accompanying her to the stage. And just before she went on, she turned to him and she said, "This Monty Python, is he one of us?" At which stage it was much too late to explain anything. So my friend said, "Yes, Prime Minister, he's a huge supporter." Reassured, she went on and she did it absolutely brilliantly, and everybody laughed, and she still didn't understand a single thing about it.
Well, Charles, it's 8 o'clock, and I think that story is unsurpassable, the dead parrot and Mrs. T, so we will finish there. There's books to be signed by Charles in the foyer, and there's drinks in the foyer. And the next Mile End group is next Tuesday with Andrew Adonis to talk on the 5 days in May, i.e. the formation of the coalition in 2010. Charles, you've given us the most wonderful evening, and you've been the most wonderful audience. I'm risking sounding like David Frost now, but I mean it very sincerely, which makes me sound like somebody else whose name I've forgotten. But wonderful evening. Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you.